Hi, Zach. Thanks for joining me today. Could you briefly introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Zach Holman. I was early on at GitHub, worked there for 5 years, did a lot of just things around GitHub as you do with a small company. And then after that, kind of moved on, started doing a lot more advising of different companies. I advised GitLab for a couple of years ahead of their IPO and did a couple of startups in there. And the last couple of years got more into angel investing. Now I've started another company again, so getting back into it. So that's me in a nutshell.
Nice. Thanks for the introduction. I think one thing that GitHub, GitLab, and StackShare have in common is that they all acquired millions of developers to their platforms. What do you think? How did they accomplish this? What did they do differently to other companies?
I think it's there's some similarities between them and between like successful companies. Some differences as well. I think like when I look back to how GitHub got their start, rule number one is timing. They crushed the timing. And I think like if GitHub weren't there, then somebody else would have. So that's like a good step up if you can kind of see the trends and say like, oh yeah, now's a really good time to do whatever. Unfortunately, you can't force the timing, which would be nice. If we could do that, then we'd all be gajillionaires and stuff. I think like once they were kind of slotted into building like a really good product, how they talked about it, how they, interact with the community. We had a lot of community events back in the day. We had one for like every couple of weeks in San Francisco for a while. And that was great because you got to see people in a more face-to-face type of thing. And when you're a really small company at that point, you just get, a different relationship with those users. We would call them super fans, basically. And we'd have people that were so into our product and they would be happy to talk to other people and grow it organically and stuff like that. GitLab, I think, did a lot of that stuff as well. They did really good at, kind of how they're branding, also how they work internally. They have a huge like open source culture, which I was super impressed by how they've done that over the years and managed to maintain that even as a public company. And just, being kind of true to what they wanted to build, which was, a bit different to how GitHub kind of tackled things, which we can dig into a little bit later. But so I don't know. There's a lot of similarities, a lot of differences,
So, if I understand you correctly, you say especially community building was kind of crucial in the early days. How did you kind of get the first 1,000 developers to kind of join that community with those initial meetups? Like, how did you find those developers that later turned into super fans?
Yeah, so let's see. So GitHub first got started in the tail end of 2007. So effectively launched in 2008. So that's before my time. I was ninth overall with the four founders in early 2010. So early on, a lot of the initial kind of start with GitHub stemmed from like what a lot of, two of the founders in particular, like Chris and PJ, they had a great blog in kind of like Rails techniques and stuff like that I was following before I even had heard of GitHub. And that was, I think, one way for them to kind of step into the role of, we've been talking and, work in the community and open sourcing stuff for a while. Now we have this other cool product. We can maybe like talk about this some more in our blog as well. So I think that really worked out really well for them. Definitely the biggest, I guess, development for GitHub was getting Ruby on Rails to switch over. Once Rails kind of switched over the project itself, I think that kind of like opened some eyes, and a lot of people are like, oh, this is like a real project. It's not just like somebody's weird weekend open source, fun hobby project and stuff. And I think that was just, in large part because, Chris and PJ and Tom were involved in, the Ruby community. It made it easier for Rails to look at that and say like, oh yeah, this is, we want to help contribute to this by getting more eyeballs on it. And it worked out for them too, because there were a lot more contributions and stuff that went into Rails after that point too. So I think that, like, in hindsight, especially with something when you're looking at like GitHub, which is programming, there's so many different disparate communities, and a lot of the communities that were there when GitHub first started are no longer that hip or cool anymore. So if like we just would have been focusing on, I don't know, Fortran or something like that, that would have been stupid anyway. But if they would have done that, it wouldn't have grown like that. So I think in hindsight, it was really good for them to get a really solid foothold in a specific language. And then it became easier to spread out and become more of a generic tool at that point later on.
Okay. And besides the kind of community work, I read somewhere that you were also involved in building the initial culture at GitHub. And I think a lot of companies are looking up to kind of the way how GitHub built its internal culture. What made GitHub's culture so special, and how did you achieve it?
Yeah, I think, at the end of the day, it's just kind of molded on open source. And the reason for that is, we didn't really have a office initially, because we worked, really remote and distributed and stuff. And then even at that point, even the people in San Francisco were traveling all the time anyway. So, the natural way for us to work was to model ourselves off of the open source projects that we worked on, outside of GitHub. And I think that's kind of the core. I mean, there's a lot of things we can talk about, like asynchronous work and chat rooms and all that sort of stuff. But like, at the end of the day, it's like, how do you get people to work on something in a distributed manner? And I think that lends itself to all of these other non-work things that we really enjoy. Like, how do you direct people to work on something? That's always kind of a stickler with some companies, where it's kind of like, oh, is it very top down and really heavy? Does that mean, are enough people looking at the kind of paper cuts and friction, like low level things that it's not glamorous, but it needs to get done. And I think all of this stuff is like, even though we're kind of working in a very kind of distributed open source fashion, it has a lot of other strong benefits that, like, I just wanted to work in that way. And that was kind of where I came into all of this stuff. The founders initially had been doing a bunch of like conference talks and stuff. And then as GitHub started getting really big, they, rightfully so, were like, oh shit, this is like a big company. We need to like start worrying about it. And then I was like, well, I don't know. I still like the idea of people giving talks and stuff. I'm like, yeah, maybe I can give some talks. And it turned out I really enjoyed it. And I think that was the reason why I want to give it so much, like all these talks and conferences and communities and stuff like that, is that I really enjoyed working this way. Mostly because the previous company I was at was fucking terrible. Like, I hated everything of how they set up management and work division and stuff like that. And that was the main reason why I just really enjoyed giving these talks, is because I can look around and say, oh no, this is great. I really enjoy it. And, you should do this too. Like, being an example that people can kind of follow. And I think part of the reason why it was so effective, for marketing and stuff for us, is that like, I didn't go set about to do marketing for GitHub. Like, I just thought there's a really cool way of working. And I thought other people could use that as well. So it was a very genuine way, that at least I would go about it. And talk about it, because I just thought it was the coolest thing ever.
But it was completely like a complete free decision by you, and not kind of planned by GitHub. So you just decided at some point, hey, I want to talk about this. Or did GitHub do anything to encourage that?
Yeah, they just let me do it. And, paid for travel and stuff like that. But I think it was just kind of like, my first talk, I think, was at RailsConf. And I was like, oh yeah, I submitted a talk here. Can I go? And they're like, yeah. And like, that was it. And then I kind of spent the next 3 or 4 years doing that type of stuff. And, every time I would get better, and, people would enjoy it and stuff. And it just kept making sense. But there's never really any decision of like, oh, now we need to, make this team and focus on talks, or, increase our bottom line with all this stuff. Like, it was just kind of interesting. I think it was a reflection on, the leadership in the company understanding that like this stuff was important, even though it's, it's not something that pays off immediately, unfortunately, but like it takes a long time to get people on the right page and be like, oh yeah, this is going to affect us down the line type of thing. So, yeah, it was a fun experience. And I think that's kind of indicative of how early GitHub worked in general in terms of like self-direction, and just supporting people to attack the things that they think they're most capable of helping out with.
You kind of, I think you stayed at GitHub until you were 250 employees, right?
Yeah, somewhere around there.
How did the company culture change over that period from like 9 to 250?
Yeah, it's a lot. And it's always funny because like I'll still talk to a lot of people now and they'll be like, oh, how did GitHub manage to do, this? And I'd be like, you're gonna have to do way more specific. Like, how did GitHub at 10 people do that, or GitHub at 100 people, or things just change so much. And I would always kind of put it in buckets of like 0 to 10, 10 to 25, 25 to 75, 75, 150, and then bigger chunks of going up there from there. But I don't know. I think that's an interesting way to start thinking about it. And it's not something that we really were good at initially. I think like at some point we became so defensive of the culture that it was difficult to make like really kind of fundamental changes in terms of growth. The big one is managers, because we didn't have a managers until I don't know, 100 plus 150 people or something like that. And in hindsight, it's kind of weird because everybody knew that they were going to be coming. Like you can't work in the same kind of managerless approach, when you're 30, much less like 300 or something like that. But like how we kind of instituted that was really tricky. And I think it's something we could have done a lot better on. And I think that's just more of understanding like what stage of growth your company's in and where it's going to be in the next year. So you're not just constantly like, chasing after the company, trying to figure out like, okay, what's next? How do we fix this? How do we fix this? It's like being a little bit more proactive about that is painful, but, necessary as well.
Another thing that came to my mind when you mentioned that obviously open source was a big part of GitHub's culture as well. And obviously the whole product is kind of about open source. Why did you ever had this discussion to also open source the whole product by yourself, or was it like nothing you were thinking about?
It came up a lot, like a lot. And I think it's, there's not necessarily a correct answer here. And I think we could probably talk about this for hours just because it is a really complicated thing, because it's, in some sense, I always say developers are like the best and the absolute worst customers to have because like they know too much. So we would get like diffs of our CSS with like a 10-line change and be like, oh, fix this, and you'll fix this one button and stuff. And it's like, cool, I appreciate that, but maybe there's a bunch of other things behind the scenes that we can't just randomly apply this sort of stuff. Granted, if it were open source, that might be a little bit different too, but it's complicated. And I think that was the main sort of thrust of the idea of why we open sourced a lot of things, especially like a lot of kind of core competency stuff, like libgit2, and participated in the Git project itself. There were a lot of things that were important that we'd open source, and I think it made sense to open source. But I think, and you can see this all over the place, where like a company will like flip the private to public switch, and they say like, ta-da, we're open source, we're done. And it's like, oh man, you just started. Like you have to deal with maintenance, you have to deal with, how do we onboard new maintainers, new contributors and stuff. It's just not so simple. And we were always, there's so many other things that we wanted to do at the time. So I think that was the main idea of just kind of like, it's also one of those things where like once you open source it, you can't unopen source it. So it's a very, pretty serious, decision to make. That said, once I started, getting involved with GitLab, they are aggressively almost entirely open source. down to their decision making and stuff is done in public, which I was kind of uncomfortable about the first few times. I was like, man, that's a lot of, for a large part, just because I don't know if you've noticed this, but the internet can be unkind. There's some like not great people on the internet sometimes, and like I feel very strongly that like your employees in particular should be protected by things, and you should be able to have these discussions and stuff. So I don't know, I was concerned about that, but like GitLab's done a great job of going very transparently open source, and I think they've been a good example of saying, yeah, you can do this. You can, not only just your source code, which I think in some sense is somewhat minor compared to, the whole stack of everything else in terms of like discussions and issues and roadmap and stuff like that. So it's an interesting spectrum. And honestly, I keep going back and forth all the time, especially as I'm building the new thing I'm working on. Is like, how much do you want to make that public? How much of it does it matter to like, keep doing it in secrecy? Or even if it's not secrecy, just like keeping it, I don't know, close to your chest or something, or just going full out like, hey, this is everything. There's so many pluses and minuses. And I think it really just depends on, your thoughts, who your employees are, what their thoughts are, what direction you want to take it. Yeah, it's a tough challenge for sure.
So if you could travel back in time and you would kind of be the person who makes the decision if GitHub goes open source or not, would you kind of do things differently?
I don't think so. Like the open source question, I joke a lot. Like I think there's more people who formerly were at GitHub that don't open source things as much anymore compared to other companies. Just because, I don't know, we have gone through weird situations and we see all of the other, support threads and stuff like that, where obviously it's not all bad. It's obviously really great too. But it's just, I think the main question is, do you have the amount of cycles and like seriousness it takes to really steward a really good open source project? And I think, at certain parts, I think we were at that point. Certain parts we definitely weren't, kind of that maturity and stuff. So yeah, it's tricky. I probably would have gone similar path as what we've taken. I do like the idea of open sourcing specific like standalone kind of modules or libraries or something, just because it's stronger, and it's intimidating, honestly, to go into like the GitHub code base and you have just a gajillion lines of code, versus like if you're looking at like, oh, how does libgit2 work or something, like you can look at just that project and stuff. So I don't know, ask me again tomorrow and I'll probably say something completely different. So
maybe let's talk about your time at GitLab, because I think you have a very unique perspective here, kind of first working for GitHub and then later advising GitLab. What do you think are the most significant differences between those two companies, since they have obviously a similar product, but GitLab is built in a completely open source way?
Yeah, I think the transparency is a huge one. I think like GitHub had a strong amount of transparency in terms of like, we talked about how we worked, we had blog posts, we would share a lot. I would just say like GitLab is the more evolved perspective, and they were aggressively open source. And the things like we would have like a handbook internally at GitHub for employees and stuff. And the fact that they open sourced there is fantastic. And like just looking at that and gleaning things on like how you would do things differently in your own company, or if you're applying to work there, you can get a really good idea even before your first day. I think that in particular is like one of the strongest things, even more than their actual product, is like how they work, their perspective on stuff. So I think like the transparency and kind of open sourceness of the entire business is a huge difference. I think like kind of how they built things is very different too, for better and for worse. Like GitLab, they're very, kind of cycle oriented. So it's like, oh, we're going to, ship something, every month or something like that. And I think that's cool because you get a really strong cadence, versus like GitHub, which I think would be a little bit more, I don't know, product led development. I think we made some really strong products. Sometimes they would take months and months and months to kind of finalize and stuff. It's that last 10% takes 90% of the time sometimes. So I think, even though that's kind of a small, thing in general, is like, how do you actually do your pace of development? I think it ends up changing a lot of how the product works. Part of the issue is if you're trying to ship something like every month type of thing or every release, you may not let things properly bake as long as you need them to, but then you also are able to, move things down the line a lot further too. Because like the classic GitHub thing is, you get your team of 3 or 4 together, you'd ship a really great product, and then you'd never touch it for 5 years or something like that, which is annoying because you've moved on to some other product, which is great for your personal happiness and stuff, but it, kind of sucks for, people relying upon that project down the line. So, I think it's also just a good example of like 2 teams that were very productive, doing things in, fairly different ways. And, they can both be right. That's kind of always my approach, is especially when I would talk about things like, we have no managers, or, how we would build things with our products and stuff. I try to be as extreme as I can possibly be, so I can get people in the audience to say like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. Or that's too much for us. And basically like question like, oh, what is the line of, what makes sense for you and your organization, your company? Because depending on what you're building and, who's at the company, it's, it changes a lot. So it's just depends on your perspective, I guess.
Okay. Let's jump to a totally different topic. I know that you're also an active angel investor, and I read your blog post about moving from engineering to angel investing. And I would be just curious to know if there were certain things that kind of helped you from engineering, like things that you learned doing your role as an engineer to make the step, and if you have any learnings that you would share with the audience.
Yeah, it's been interesting. The answer is yes. Having like technical knowledge is, it already puts you way, way ahead of most investors and most like VCs. Like it's just the amount of stories I hear of somebody who's like, oh yeah, I'm a developer. And I'm like, you coded like Java 3 in like 98 or something. Like that was the last time you've really done anything. It's like things have changed quite a bit. So, it's being involved in that side of things, or in product or design or support infrastructure, something that's a little more technical. It goes a long way, both in terms of identifying companies and, being plugged in and getting the leads and, knowing who to invest in. It's been interesting. I got into it mostly just because I started advising different companies, StackShare, GitLab, DocBit. There were a couple other smaller startups and stuff. And then I just found investing to be kind of a extension of advising a company, except you put money into it. It's kind of backwards, I guess. But and I just found it really interesting because, there's the classic question of, do you want to know a lot of different things shallowly or one thing really deeply? And I think that like, in our normal day-to-day jobs, we tend to know that company really deeply, as long as you've been there for like more than a year or something. But once you start advising or investing, like you get so many, at least the high level of a lot of different other startups and companies. And like our brains just, you start making patterns of like, what is a good company? What is a bad company? And like, I had kind of thoughts maybe, or like gut feelings. But, it's hard unless you kind of get, involved in more than one company. It's hard to really quantify that. This is why like contractors and consultants and stuff, are great because they have perspective in a lot of different, areas and stuff. So I found that to be like the most interesting, is just getting, dipping the toes into something a little different, especially if it's something I would not work in. I'd be like, oh, that's not something I'm deeply passionate in, but I'm really interested in it. So I get to get context and get exposed to that a little bit more, and just kind of learn more about, how does software work across, industries and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Okay, cool. Kind of last question. I know that you're today kind of back in the founders game and working on your own startup. Can you share a sneak preview of what you're working on with WorkOn?
Yeah. So it's not dev tools, which I'm honestly really happy to say. I don't know, just as being, I'm still obviously investing and, talking, and still love dev tools, but, I don't know, it's just fun to do something completely different for a while. So WorkOn, it's in kind of sports right now. My co-founder is Jimmy Conrad. He was in the 2006 World Cup for the US, the greatest soccer/football team on the planet. Criminally underrated, even though we don't win a lot. But it's not about winning. It's about how strong idiots in America will talk up your team on podcasts like this. Anyway, yeah. So we're gonna start with soccer, but then sprout in some other stuff. And I can be vague and stuff like this, but we're basically like rethinking how you do training and how do you have access to better training and better people, even though you may grow up in strange areas. I grew up in Fargo, North Dakota, and let me tell you, not a lot of soccer players in Fargo, North Dakota when I grew up. So this is near and dear to my heart as well. So yeah, more to come, but it's fun to just kind of get back and, I don't know, just kind of build from day zero again. Especially like I've been tasked with a different nonprofit I'm working with, and they had a very legacy code base, which was terrible, which is also fun in weird ways to dig into that. But like, it's also fun to just go straight from like a new code base and make my own personal mistakes and then grow them from there. So, everyone likes their own mistakes that they make rather than dealing with somebody else's dumb decisions from 8 years ago. So, yeah, so it's been fun. It's been interesting. That'll be ask me again in another couple of years, and we'll see if I'm still happy and excited about it.
Awesome. I definitely wish you best of luck with that project. And yeah, thanks again for joining me on that show today. I think there were definitely a bunch of interesting insights. And yeah, wish you all the best.
Cool. Thanks for having me.